For the second part of this lecture, we shall now discuss two themes. First, it is actually an artistic theme, which is the theme of the three youths. Like this image that you are seeing right now, which is very common in other contexts as well, and we'll try to understand what actually this image means when it is found in a catacomb. Then we shall be discussing another sarcophagus, okay, like the dogmatic sarcophagus, which we have already discussed. This time it is called the Jonah sarcophagus because the sarcophagus contains many images from the story of Jonah. And as we shall see, it offers a completely different interpretation than the one of the dogmatic sarcophagus, which we have seen a couple of lectures ago. So let's start with the scene of the three youths in the furnace. Now, this is one of the most common themes in catacombal paintings and also on sarcophagal reliefs from the 3rd century onwards. What is the story of these three young men? Now, the story is found, as we said, in the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, where the Jews had been deported, ordered that everyone had to adore a golden statue of himself, which he placed in the square in the center of the city. And these three young men refused to pay homage to this statue, and therefore they were condemned to be thrown alive into a furnace. As things happened, when the people were throwing more wood into the furnace for the flames to grow even bigger, the king started saying that instead of seeing 3 men, he was seeing 4 men. And eventually, he asked the soldiers to switch off the fire, basically, to put out the fire, and the 3 young men came out alive and unscathed. Okay, so the story in itself is a story of salvation, as it's found in the book of Daniel in chapter 3. Now, beginning with an early 3rd century fresco, which is found in the catacomb of Priscilla, which is the one that you are seeing now, the compositions of the story of the 3 young men have a remarkable consistency. Nearly all of them show the 3 standing with hands lifted up in prayer, okay, in the orant posture that we have seen many times till now. They are all dressed in short tunics, and they usually wear the funny hats, the Smurf hats, that are also worn by the Magi in the Epiphany scenes, okay? Why? The reason why these 3 wear these kind of hats is because their story takes place in Babylon. Babylon is in the east, the Magi came from the east, and therefore, in order to show that they are all from the east, we give them the Smurf hats, okay? Very rarely, these 3 young men are represented in the act of refusing to adore the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And in these scenes, the king, as well as some soldiers and the idol, are included. And this is one of the rare episodes when we see this scene, okay? We can see the king with his statue in front of him. As you can see, they are the same face, okay? We realize it is a statue because it is found on a plinth rather than on a pair of legs. We have the 3 young men who are refusing to adore the statue, and we have an onlooker, maybe a soldier or a citizen, who is either trying to convince the young men to pay homage to the statue, or else he is kind of looking shocked at the audacity of these 3 young men. In many cases, the scene of the youths in the furnace, the scenes are juxtaposed with a figure of Noah at the sea in his box-shaped ark, and about to receive the dove with the olive branch. Okay, so as you can see, you have seen this image already. Even though they are 2 separate scenes, they are in some way linked. Okay, how are they linked? The linking point is that dove. All right, the dove technically forms part of Noah's story, but the dove is found exactly above the head of the person who is throwing more fire into the wood. So in some way it also includes it in the story of the fairness of the three young men. There is, in the Bible, at least, there is no connection between these two stories, but the frequent connection of these two biblical episodes in art suggests that for ancient Christians, they must have had something in common. As we said, this is not something that we find only in this image that you are seeing here. We find it many times. Okay, the two scenes juxtaposed one on the other, can say. The scene of the youth's refusal to worship idols often appears in conjunction with scenes of the Magi offering their gifts to Christ as a child, and perhaps to suggest the contrast between true and false veneration of the divine being. All right, so if we find an image like the one that we have seen previously, like this one, the three young men choosing not to adore the false idol of Nebuchadnezzar, and just above or below this scene, we'd find a scene of the Epiphany. I think the message is very clear. Okay, those who choose to refuse adoration to a pagan god are actually choosing to adore the true God. When we have something like this, the connection is a bit more difficult to make. A possible interpretation of this scene, especially considering that it first appeared in the 3rd century, is that the three youths in the fiery furnace represent early Christian martyrs who, like them, refused to adore idols and were persecuted. While the youths were delivered by God through their prayers, that's why they are in the orange figure, the martyrs were made victorious by their prayers, not by being given back the earthly life, as was the case of the three young men, but rather they were given a life that never ends. So this would be one of the reasons why this image started to appear in the 3rd century. In the 3rd century, Christians were still persecuted. Okay, so this could be kind of a reminder of, let's say, the intervention of God in the salvation of those who are faithful to Him. In the Old Testament, salvation meant being saved from death. In the New Testament, or rather in the life of the Church, salvation meant being given eternal life. Early Christian writers who saw this significance in the biblical story, beginning as early as the late 1st century, in the epistle known as the first letter of Clement to the Corinthians, we already start seeing this kind of link, okay, between the three young men and the martyrdoms that were taking place. About a century later, towards the end of the 2nd century, Tertullian interpreted this story as a moral exhortation during the times of persecutions, using it to encourage his fellow Christians to stand firm. And this was then repeated by Cyprian about 50 years later in an epistle. And this is what we read in the Epistle of Clement. God, in his goodness, has allied with you in glorious confession young boys as well. Okay, so the young boys might actually be referring to the ones in the book of Daniel. To us, he has made manifest deeds such as the illustrious youths Ananias, Azarias, and Misael once did. Okay, so here the reference is very clear. Those are the names of the three youths mentioned in the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel. When they were shut up on the furnace, the fire drew back from them, and the flames yielded them a place of refreshment. For the Lord was present with them, proving that against his confessors and martyrs the heat of hellfire could have no power, but that those who believed in God would continue ever safe and in every way secure. Okay, so suddenly the flames of the furnace are compared to the flames of hell. Just as the flames of the furnace did not hurt Ananias, Azarias, and Misael, likewise, the flames of hell will not hurt the martyrs. I ask you in your piety to ponder carefully the faith which those boys possessed, a faith which could win God's favor so fully. Now here Clement makes reference to the fact that the Lord was with them in the fairness. Okay, now as you have seen, in the images, we never see 4 figures, we only see 3. But we see that other thing with them, okay, and we can go back and see what it is. Okay, here we can see it over here, above the head of the one throwing more fire, and here we see it flying over there. Okay, so the 4th figure is present in these images, but it is not presented as another person, as the Lord, but rather as a dove. Okay, so the dove could actually represent the presence of God with the people who are suffering. Undoubtedly, therefore, the image must, to some degree, have reflected the issue of martyrdom. Yet, the frequent placement of this image next to the story of Noah suggests 2 other possible interpretations. One that parallels the destruction of the sinful race by means of the water and fire, and the other that places emphasis on Noah's and the youth's salvation or rescue from death, rather than their willingness to undergo it. Okay, so when we see something like this, it could probably actually mean this. The water of the story of Noah destroyed evil and saved Noah, who was the good man. In the story of the 3 young men, the more wood was thrown into the fire, obviously the more the flames grew. But rather than hurting the people who were in the furnace, they ended up burning the evil men who were throwing more fire. Okay, if you read the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel, you will find all this. Okay, the men who were literally trying to increase the flames were the men who were killed. Therefore, the good people are saved through the fire, while the evil ones are destroyed. Okay, that is why we are saying that the first interpretation could be actually the fact that water and fire save the good and destroy the evil. So water and fire rescued Noah and these 3 young men from death. The first interpretation, seeing this image as a reference to the eschatological, therefore the end of time, judgment day, suggests a moralistic emphasis. Out of destruction, water, fire, whatever, the righteous and only those will be rescued. Okay, so we can say that the furnace burning and the flood could be a representation of Judgment Day. Who are the people who will be saved at Judgment Day? They will be the ones who have lived according to the precepts of God. Okay, all the others will be lost. Therefore, this could be actually a moral lesson, we can say, for the people to live as they should. Because when death comes, being the individual's death or even the end of days, it will be only the good who will be rescued. The second interpretation that emphasizes rescue as a form of resurrection, therefore these people who come out of the furnace and Noah who comes out of the ark as new people thanks to the transformation they went through because of this experience, here we have therefore a scene of a resurrection, a new life. So more this idea of the resurrection rather than the salvation of those who are righteous alone. This seems less threatening and more hopeful than the other one. Okay, so the first interpretation is kind of beware, because if you are not good, you will not be saved. The second interpretation is more water and fire, so the ugly experiences in life help us to be born again, to start anew. Now, the story of the 3 youths in the furnace is a demonstration of the preservation or the resurrection of the physical body. Okay, remember that these 3 come out of the furnace unscathed. Therefore, the bodies survive this trial. Noah in the ark is also represented as kind of coming out of the ark alive with his body. And therefore, these two images in this case, if they represent resurrection, might be typologies of baptism. Okay, why? Because baptism in itself is a kind of resurrection. One dies in baptism and is born again. And the people who are baptized kind of receive the promise from Christ that eventually they will undergo physical resurrection even after their death. In order to understand this connection, a simple reference to some New Testament texts that comment Old Testament texts may prove enough. In the first letter of Peter, chapter 3, verse 20 and 21, we read, God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, therefore the story of the ark prefigures baptism, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, so it's not simply taking away the sin, the mark of sin, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay, so baptism is in itself an appeal to have a good conscience, knowing that one is saved through the resurrection of Jesus. Noah's experience on the ark, floating on the waters that drowned the earth, is understood as an Old Testament prefiguration of baptism, as we read here. The dove serves as a connecting symbol. The dove arriving at the ark in the scene is linked to the dove which descends on Jesus during his baptism. Therefore, like Noah, the 3 youths are also figuratively baptized, since martyrdom was considered as a baptism of blood. So that scene of the 3 young men in the furnace with the dove flying over them could actually mean a baptism of blood. Therefore, once again recalling baptism, the presence of the dove always reminds us of that. These interpretations share the common theme of triumph over evil and the victory over death, a theme that was deemed appropriate for decorating a tomb or a sarcophagus. At the end of the 4th century, John Chrysostom frequently used the 3 young men as models of courage, nobility, and steadfastness in the face of death, of evil, or of temptation. In more than one place, Chrysostom speaks of the youth's escape from death as equivalent to the Christian's escape from the devil and winning a wreath of victory first through baptism and then by continually resisting evil. Okay, so even as late as the very late 4th century with St. John Chrysostom, this was very much the case. Okay, so the 3 young men came to represent the victory of good over evil, first through baptism and eventually through the trials of every day, wherein a person is encouraged to choose what is good and to avoid what is evil. So enough about the 3 young men, and let's go and analyze another sarcophagus. And this time, as we said, the sarcophagus is that of Jonah. Okay, here you can see the images of the dove, which is present in the scenes of Noah and also of the 3 young men. So this is the Jonah sarcophagus. Okay, now if you have a look at the whole thing, you'll see that there are many stories of many episodes of the story of Jonah, but then there are also intertwined in them some other stories. Okay, so the stories of Jonah are very clearly seen. Here, Jonah, who is thrown into the sea and into the mouth of the fish, then Jonah, who is spat out of the fish, and Jonah, who is resting underneath a tree. Okay, and then everything is linked in some way. Okay, here we can see Noah Here we can see some episodes. We'll discuss them when the time comes. Here, once again, we have another episode. Okay, so these are all in some way linked to the main story, which is the story of Jonah, which runs from here all the way up to here. Now, this is a late 3rd century sarcophagus. Okay, so it was sculpted, let's say, around the year 290, roughly. And it is among the most famous and most extensively studied sarcophagi of the early Christian era. The main movement of the composition takes the eye from the ship here, okay, down to the first sea monster, which is this, and then up from the second sea monster to the scene where Jonah is sleeping in blissful innocence beneath the tree. Okay, so as we said, the movement is actually this. Interpreting this sarcophagus in the light of Matthew 12:40, which is this, as Jonah was in the whale's belly 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So if we interpret that sarcophagus, the story that we see there with this verse, which is one of the very few cases where in the New Testament we find a reference to the story of Jonah, we understand that this movement is clearly about the resurrection. Okay, the fact that Jesus remains in the earth, in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, means that afterwards he will come back out. Okay, and he'll come back out resurrected. Therefore, that movement, the story of Jonah, is already in itself an image of the resurrection. But whose resurrection? It is not simply the resurrection, or rather the new life of Jonah. Neither is it referring to simply the resurrection of Christ, but rather it is referring to the resurrection of all the faithful. And now an analysis of each section of the sarcophagus can help us appreciate this better. So now we start seeing the sarcophagus bit by bit and see how each part is linked to the other and how those, let's say, secondary stories that are represented here and there, how they fit in the main theme. So, first and foremost, we'll start with the raising of the storm. In the book of Jonah, it is God who raises the great storm that leads the sailors to throw Jonah as the unwilling prophet into the sea. Okay? On this sarcophagus, the storm is the work of these two small figures that can be seen below the upper rim of the sarcophagus and just above the sail. So we'll go back to the sarcophagus. We are actually at the moment analyzing this bit. Okay, you see the two faces here? That is what we have here. Now, who are these? Now, knowing these must entail some knowledge of mythology. Okay, remember, mythological episodes and mythological figures were used even in Christian art. Okay, now this sarcophagus is certainly a Christian piece of art. Okay, first of all, because there are representations of Jonah taken from the Bible, and as we said, they cannot be Jewish, but they are necessarily Christians. The other episodes here and there, okay, some of them might be references, I'm not giving any spoilers, they might be references to episodes to the New Testament. So this is surely a Christian sarcophagus. Now, how is it that we find these two mythological and pagan figures in it? Okay, and we have to know who they are. Okay, so we have a lady on the left peeping as if through a round window, and something that looks like an angel on the right. Now the angel is actually blowing. Okay, you can see him with his mouth, with his face all puffed up, and the lips also give the kind of illusion that he is actually blowing. And this thing that looks here like a wing of an angel is actually the wind. Okay, it is not a wing. it's the wind. Anyway, so we'll start with the lady first. The lady looking through a window, a very round window. Now, most probably, this is a symbol of the moon, okay? The moon, which is always represented high above the other scenes. And here we are actually below the rim of the sarcophagus. Therefore, if that is the moon, it would give us the impression that the story that is going on happens at night. Okay? Therefore, the wind, the storm, starts at night. And the night is very appropriate to represent the darkness of sin, which is cast away when the sun, therefore Christ, rises. Okay? So, whoever made the sarcophagus is giving the impression that what is going on is happening at night. The other figure, who, as we said, is a male youth with puffed cheeks and with curls behind him, seem to be pointing to the fact that it is he who provoked the storm through his blowing. Okay? In classical mythology, storms were raised by Aeolus, who was the wind god. So if this is a mythological god, then even the female figure must be a goddess. Okay? And she can either be Selene, who is the common goddess of the moon, or else it could be Juno, the mother goddess, okay, who was also worshipped as the goddess of the crescent moon. Okay, but there we don't have a crescent moon, it is a whole moon because the circle looks complete. Okay, therefore, most probably the lady there is the goddess Selene. In the first book of the Aeneid, which is written by Virgil, Juno gets Aeolus to strike Aeneas' ship with a great storm, hoping to prevent the destiny that she fears. And what is the destiny that she fears? That Aeneas will find a home in Italy and build a civilization there to rival her favorite Carthage. Okay, now even during the Trojan War, Juno was siding with the Greeks. Okay, and Aeneas was a Trojan. Therefore, it all fits very perfectly. All right, so here, the first image, the starting point, is actually taken from mythology. Okay, the link between the goddess and the god of the goddess of the moon and the god of the wind are enough to start this dark storm. Okay, and remember, night, darkness is always a representation of sin. And obviously, presenting sin with pagan gods is perfect. Now, the striking substitution of pagan gods for the Lord as the instigators of the storm leads the viewer to consider how Jonah might represent Aeneas. Okay? As we said, if we read the Bible, it is God who starts the storm. In the sarcophagus, it is these pagan gods. And so there could be some kind of link between the figure of Jonah and the figure of Aeneas. If we think of Jonah's experience as a symbol of baptism, the evil gods may here represent the forces that conspire to keep him from his true homeland, which is heaven. Now, in the Aeneid, Juno does her best to stop Aeneas from reaching Italy, and Italy eventually becomes the homeland of Aeneas because he founds Alba Longa, and eventually from Alba Longa, Rome is founded. The homeland, we can say, of Jonah is actually Nineveh, the place where he had to go. And this storm, in this case, can be interpreted as something stopping Jonah from reaching that land. If we take this all, let's say, on a symbolic level, obviously it comes to the conclusion that the forces of evil, as I have said, represented by the pagan gods, stop the person, represented by Jonah, from reaching his homeland, which is heaven. Okay, remember that we are here on a sarcophagus, so the hope is that the person who is in the sarcophagus actually at some point made it all the way to heaven. Let's move slightly below. And we see the scene of Jonah being thrown into the sea. Now, Aeolus and Selene or Juno are found just on top of here, okay, for you to understand better how we are moving. Now, Jonah is thrown naked into the sea, where the monster is expecting him with its wide open jaws. His nakedness of Jonah, might be a reference to the tradition that catechumens enter the baptismal pool naked in order to evoke their birth, which through baptism is renewed. Okay, so this, I think, the symbology is quite straightforward. The reason why people were requested to get baptized naked was to remember their birthday. Okay, everyone is born naked, and therefore this rite is like a new birth for the person. So the naked Jonah, and it makes no sense to have Jonah naked when he is thrown into the sea, could be actually a reference to that, okay? Because catechumens were immersed, not thrown, were immersed into the water actually naked. So this could be actually a parallelism of the two things. The monster, which with his forked tail, and here we see the forked tail, okay, of a whale, but with the twisted body of a serpent. Now, this is a monster like no other, okay? Many times the monster is represented either as a big fish or as some kind of sea serpent. But here we have, I think, the face of a shark, the body of a serpent, and the tail of a whale, which is quite unusual. Now, in the original Greek text of the Gospel of Matthew, where he speaks about this episode, okay, Matthew 12:40, when Jesus is speaking of Jonah staying for 3 days into the belly of the fish, the term for whale is used, and it is the term ketos, okay? And this can be translated either as whale or else as a reference to any monster of the sea, okay? So ketos actually has two meanings, either whale, which is where we got the idea that Jonah was swallowed by a whale, or else it could be any other sea monster. The original Hebrew version of the book of Jonah, written in the Hebrew scriptures, does not specify that it was a whale. It was actually a sea monster. Now, an ancient Corinthian vase pictures Perseus slaying the sea monster, which it labels as Ketos. Okay? So this is Perseus killing the monster, and you can see there is some kind of resemblance between this thing and this thing here, and it is written as Ketos, and this is Ketos, okay? It is quite skewed, but this is clearly a K. This is an epsilon, which is any with the round edges. This is a T, this is an omicron, and this is a sigma. Okay, it is an S, but rather than standing, it is kind of lying down. Okay, that is why it looks like an M, but it is actually a sigma, an S. So we know that Ketos means also sea monster, thanks to this kind of parallelism between different archaeological artifacts. The next episode is Jonah being thrown out from this monster onto the sea, or rather onto the land, but there is still the sea visible. In the second chapter of the book of Jonah, we read, "The Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited out Jonas upon the dry land." But what are we seeing here? Jonah is not on the shore. Okay, he is being disgorged into a sea teeming with creatures. Okay, so this is the sea actually, as you can see. Okay, and here we can see all different kinds of creatures in this sea. In detail, we can see 3 fish. Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, the fish are somewhere. Sorry, spoiler. the sea, the fish are somewhere in the sea here. We can see a crab, which is this one. We can see a salamander, and we can see also a snail. So let's say it's a mixture of sea and land. Okay, therefore Jonah is not exactly thrown on the dry shore, rather he is thrown somewhere between the shore and the sea. Above the neck of the beast, Noah is in his ark, who is receiving the olive branch from the dove. Okay, so this is Noah, and the dove is behind him. Obviously, the reason it is found there because there is no room to put the dove here. Okay, so these are the artistic liberties that these sculptures used to take. All right, so Noah is taking the olive branch from the dove, which is found directly behind him. Noah was saved by the ark. The ark is that floating box. So here, the new life that is given to Jonah through the water, okay, Jonah is being thrown out of the water towards, let's put it like that, the dry sea, is given to him by baptism. And the presence of Noah also points to this, okay? Noah, who was saved by the sea, receives kind of baptism by the Holy Spirit represented by the dove. Okay, so all this is a representation of baptism, the new life that is given by the Holy Spirit through the water. Okay, and remember, the one who performs the miracle of the water is actually the Holy Spirit in the baptismal liturgy. The next episode of Jonah is Jonah under the tree. This part of the sarcophagus relates to the story found in the 4th chapter of Jonah, where God gives Jonah a time of rest under the shade of a gourd tree, in order to teach him a lesson about mercy. But the theme here is not mercy. It is the abundant life that awaits the believer in the kingdom of God. How can we understand that we're speaking about the abundant life? We can see it by comparing the size of the fruit and the leaves with Jonah. Okay, that tree is an image of abundance because the leaves are nearly as big as him, and also the fruit of the tree are bigger than his thighs, basically. So, on the right side of the sarcophagus, the artist uses material signifiers to express this spiritual abundance. Okay, the big gourds here and the big leaves. The nakedness of Jonah recalls the nakedness of Adam when he was still innocent before sinning. Okay, so once again, Jonah is unnecessarily naked, so he must represent something else. And the abundance of the tree makes us remember the story of the situation of Adam in Eden before he sinned. Okay, he was naked, and there was an abundance of trees and fruit around him, enough for him to live without having to work. Therefore, here, the naked Jonah, surrounded by such plenty, is a representation of paradise. Okay, so we have moved very much away from the story of Jonah. Okay, the interpretation given in this sarcophagus is actually the presence of the soul in eternal bliss, thanks to the baptism, to the sacrament received during baptism. Many scholars believe that Jonah's pose under the tree is taken from the imagery from non-Christian sarcophagi, like, for example, the image of Endymion, which is now found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. As you can see, the posture is practically the same. The only difference is that Endymion has a cloak which is hardly covering anything. Okay? But as you can see, the rest is exactly the same. So once again, Christian artists might have been inspired by pagan iconography. Moving on, we see one of the, let's say, peripheral scenes, and we'll start from the top. And I think this is a very now common scene, okay? It is the raising of Lazarus. Whenever we see someone wrapped up like a doll or a baby in a niche, that is always the raising of Lazarus. This is the typical Paleo-Christian image of the raising of Lazarus, which is faithfully following the story found in chapter 11 of the Gospel according to John. Mary is kneeling at Jesus' feet. Okay, so this time, if you remember some of the images we have seen in previous sarcophagi, the woman is usually touching the hem of Jesus' dress. Okay, and we said those are uniting two scenes together. In this case, the lady is not touching the hem, so it is one of the sisters of Lazarus. So she is kneeling at Jesus' feet, and his arm gesture is the common device for indicating that a figure is saying something. Okay, as we said, whenever we have an arm outstretched, and sometimes we have that very particular posture, remember the fingers. Here, unfortunately, it's mutilated, but probably that was how the figure was. It is referring to a word being spoken. Okay, so in this case, Jesus must be saying the words found in the Gospel, Lazarus, come forth. At his shoulder, there is Martha, who worries about her brother, who should be now stinking. Okay, the figure can be identified as Martha because she is wearing feminine clothing, and probably Martha is this one here. This one here, sorry. Okay, you can see that she's wearing a dress very clearly, and it seems that she had a hand raised towards her mouth or her nose. Okay, so that would probably remind us that Martha tells Jesus, look, he's been in there for 4 days, he must be stinking now. So this is a detail which is not usually found in this kind of representation, which comes from such an early period. The presence of this miracle in the sarcophagus fits perfectly with the motif of a new life being, a new life through baptism, or a new life in paradise that is given by God to his friends. The other people present must be the disciples. Okay? Don't be too impressed by this very sweet face, which looks very much like this one. Probably these are later editions. Okay, probably the faces were completely chopped off. In fact, you can see here a line, which was probably where the head fell off or something, and even here you can see it. So these are later additions in order to kind of to try and recreate the artifact. Okay. Maybe the face of Martha was not remade because the head is still stuck there. Okay, in this case, probably the others, the heads were completely chopped off. All right. Now, if we move to another of the minor images, we find this. Okay, and this is an image that we have already seen many times. Okay, and it is Moses getting water from the rock. It also looks very similar to what we have seen in the dogmatic sarcophagus of St. Peter drawing the water from the rock and the soldiers drinking. But probably what makes this Moses and not St. Peter is because the people are not wearing hats. Okay, soldiers usually wore hats. Therefore, this is probably Moses and not Peter. So, the theme of the water that saves the thirsty Israelites from death also fits with the motif of a new life given by God. And remember also, since this is the story of Jonah, which is the main story, water is a common motif as well. Okay, the water that saves Jonah and transforms him is the same water that transforms and gives new life to the Israelites who were dying of thirst. And now we have another strange theme. Okay, this is a very mysterious image. It is similar to scenes from sarcophagi depicting the arrest of Saint Peter. If you remember, we have seen this kind of thing on other sarcophagi. Okay, we have someone who is kind of being moved by two other men. Okay, and in the case of the other sarcophagi, it was very clear that this person was Peter because, first of all, Peter was present in other scenes because of the rooster. We know it was Peter because of the rooster, but here we don't have any roosters. And also, there is the issue of the hats. Okay, in the superimposed image, you can see that the soldiers are wearing hats, but in the image on the sarcophagus, they do not have hats. This is an original head. This is obviously remade, but the original head does not have a hat. Therefore, it's a mystery. Now, as we said, soldiers usually wear hats. Here we don't have any hats. So, is it the arrest of Peter? Most probably it is not. There are also multiple figures, probably females, because they have no beards. Okay? Who seem to be clutching the feet of the middle male. Okay, so the person in the center is being kind of harassed by these female figures at the very bottom. Now, what could this be? It could be an image of the resurrected Christ linking together two episodes that happen on Easter Sunday. First of all, we have the women at the tomb who clutch Jesus' feet when he appears to them, as we read in Matthew 28, verse 9. Okay, as soon as he appears to them, the women go to pay homage to him by kissing his feet. So this could be actually that image. The part above, where there are the two men with Jesus, in this case, could be a representation of the story of the disciples of Emmaus. And there they are urging Jesus to remain with them, as we read in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24. So rather than dragging Peter to jail, this could be the two disciples urging people to stay with them after they had walked together all the way from Jerusalem to Emmaus. If this is so, therefore, if this is an image of two episodes that happened on Easter Sunday, probably this is the first image of the resurrected Christ in Christian iconography. Remember that we are at the end of the 3rd century, therefore in 290, something like that. So this would be the first image of the resurrected Christ. Next, there is the shepherd. Okay, this time the shepherd is a bit different from the kind of shepherds that we have seen up till now, okay, because the shepherds usually have the sheep on their shoulders. All right, this shepherd does not have sheep. Rather than holding the sheep on his shoulder, he is holding his pedum, his stick, and he is encouraging sheep to come out of something that looks quite similar to Lazarus' tomb. So here we are at the two far edges of the sarcophagus. On one side we have the tomb of Lazarus, and it is very clear that it is a tomb because Lazarus is all still enshrouded in it. At the other end we have a similar structure with ginormous sheep coming out of it. It might mean that the Good Shepherd is leading his flock from death to life. Okay, therefore coming out of the tomb is a way of moving from death to life. Therefore, from death to eternal life, because they are coming out of the tomb, therefore they must be dead. The enormous size of the sheep might refer to the countless numbers of the ones being saved. Okay, so rather than sculpting as many sheep, small sheep as he could coming out of that tomb, the artist decided to make two enormous sheep, okay, representing abundance once again. Okay, just below this scene we have the enormous leaves and the enormous gourds. The enormous sheep would represent the multiplicity of numbers, we can say. Moving slightly more, we find this image. Okay, now we are just below the scene of the Good Shepherd, and it is very clear here that we have a fisherman, okay, a person with a fishing rod, and he is throwing the fishing rod with its thread into the sea. Here there is the hands of Jonah who is coming out of the large fish's mouth, okay, the sea monster's mouth. Therefore, this must necessarily be in the sea, and therefore the person must be fishing. In the composition of this scene, the arc formed by the man, the rod, and caught fish are echoed in the posture of the bird or whatever it is that is in its beak. Okay, so here we have this important arc. Okay, we have this bird here, and it has something in its beak. The scene teems with living things. Okay, we have fish, we have the crab, we have the snail somewhere further here. We have the salamander, which is not visible because I hate salamanders and therefore I cut it out. And here we can kind of see the beginning of the body of Jonah. This could be a reference to the Last Judgment. Okay, everyone will be taken out of his comfort zone, which is the sea, the water, in order to be judged by the fisherman, who is, in this case, representing Christ. This child here, representing beside the fisherman, might represent the angel pointing to the good persons. And the goose, the bird, might represent death or the devil, since it gobbles up the fish rather than take them with it. So the fisherman will catch the fish, put them in his bag, and take them home with him. This creature here will gobble up whatever it grabs. And therefore, this could be a representation of actually the devil, death, hell, whatever. Okay? Because whoever enters this bird will remain there. There is no way of taking him back out. Jonah reaches out in a gesture of supplication to this fisherman. Okay, so Jonah seems to be praying to the fisherman, who has just landed a quite substantial fish. So the fish here, the fisherman has just grabbed this big fish here. The fisherman and his boy may have been inspired from the fishers who used to stand over the waters, as we read in the book of Ezekiel. Okay, in Ezekiel's vision of the tower, or of the waters floating from the temple, we read the following. So this is Jonah, who seems to be kind of supplicating the fisherman, asking the fisherman to take him with him. Therefore, a prayer of the soul to be saved. And in the book of Ezekiel, this is what we read. This water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah. And when it enters the sea of stagnant waters, the water will become fresh. Wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live. And there will be many fish once these waters reach there. It will become fresh, and everything will live where the river goes. People will stand fishing beside the sea from Ein Gedi and Ein Gedi, and it will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of a great many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. So probably the iconographer had actually this scene in mind, because he kind of included all those creatures moving in the water. Okay, and the presence of the fisherman shows that that water is the water that gives life. Okay, so whoever goes with the fisherman will eventually attain eternal life. Finally, we have the scene of which happens before, let's say, before Jonah is thrown into the water. Okay, this is the ship, and this is the beginning of the scene where eventually Jonah is thrown into the mouth of the fish. Now, this thing here could either be an oar, or else it could be the plank from which people moved from the mainland in order to ride the ship, okay, to get on the ship. So this could be actually the scene of loading Jonah's ship. Probably this scene was included in order to balance the scene of the fishermen on the opposite side. Here we see a fisherman who is dressed just like the other one, okay, and who has a similar basket in his hand. Remember that the previous fisherman had a basket, okay? Take note of what he's wearing on his head, and here we see something very similar, okay? So this could be a creation to balance the two sides. This part was probably still left empty, and therefore the artist created this scene in order to make it balance out, kind of. What is the fisherman doing? The fisherman is giving a basket to the sailor, okay? We know he is one of the sailors because he is undressed. And if we remember the scene where where Jonah is being thrown into the sea, there the sailors are also undressed. Okay, so therefore he is one of the sailors of the ship. What could be in that basket? We understand that there should be the provisions for the voyage. Okay, if one goes for a voyage, he needs to have food with him. It could also represent the beginning of life's journey. Remember that the story of Jonah is actually the life of every person. Okay, he is first living as a sinner away from God. Then, through the experience of the water, he is baptized. He comes out of baptism, he prays to the fishermen, and then eventually he ends up in paradise, where there are those enormous leaves and those enormous fruits, etc. So this part of the scene could represent the beginning of the life journey of the person, or even it could be an allusion to the Eucharist. Why? Because the provisions that we need for this life in order to reach paradise is actually the Eucharist. Remember what I told you about St. Ignatius of Antioch. In one of his letters, he clearly says that the antidote for immortality is the Eucharist. Okay, therefore, that could be an image of the Eucharist which is given to the people who are starting their voyage in life in order to finally reach that state of eternal bliss, which is represented by the naked Jonah lying underneath the tree. All in all, this sarcophagus touches many important points related to Christian belief, especially as we have seen the themes of baptism, the theme of a new life, and also the theme of judgment. Now, if you remember, when we studied all the other sarcophagi and all the other works of art, we never found anything related to judgment. So, as we said, this sarcophagus gives us a message which is very different from the others. It does have in common the theme of baptism and maybe the theme of new life with other forms of art, but when it comes to judgment, this is quite unique. And as we said, the judgment is seen in that part on the right of the sarcophagus, the fisherman, which is collecting the good, and that bird, which is swallowing the evil. Okay, and as we said, the image of Jonah, which is right in front of the scene, could be an image of the person praying to be among those who are chosen by the fisherman to be taken eventually to heaven. So with that, we finish our course. Okay, I do hope that these images that we have been seeing and also their interpretation, apart from being something which you hopefully liked, will be something also which help you appreciate a bit more all that we have to say about Christian art, especially the early Christian art, where we understand that every image is used for a very specific reason. Okay, nothing is used randomly, but it is our kind of little adventure to try and find the correct interpretation of all these images.